to the question of, is the rapture good theology? I need to preface it with this one caveat. It's you can't really say yes or no because it depends on what you mean by rapture. If you simply meant the translation of living Christians from basically normal human to being with Christ at the end, well, yeah, it's good theology because it's there in the text, right? It's right there. 1 Thessalonians. Jesus talks about it. It's right there. Yeah, great. It's great theology. It's good exegesis. But if you mean, and when most people talk about the rapture, they do mean the pre-tribulational rapture, that's where things get sketchy. And that's sort of going to be the nature of the conversation today. Is that version, again, very specifically the pre-tribulational rapture, is that good theology? So to understand what it is, we should probably start with the history of the it's not really a group, it's a movement that this particular thought comes out of. It sort of is originated within what's called dispensationalism. I am a dispensationalist. There's probably some caveats now, but Donnie is going to recount the history sort of the dispensational movement a little bit, and we'll give it a little bit on my history as well, a little bit of where I come from in the world.
Okay, it's real difficult to trace exactly when the first ever notions of the rapture ever came into the zeitgeist, because elements of it have always existed in Christianity in some way, shape, or form. But the person, I guess, who really put it together was a guy named John Nelson Darby. I believe that was his name. He was 19th century guy from the UK. And he was a guy who pretty much devoted his entire life to Christianity and to the ministry. And he kind of started this group called dispensationalists, which are not quite a denomination. In fact, dispensationalism actually there's certain denominations that tend to favor it more so than others. It's more like I guess the way I would put it is like a theological attitude.
It's more of a theological position than a specific denomination, and it's very prevalent within what I am, which is non-denominational, right? Darby, and we'll get into Schofield here in a second. That was the big move, is sort of the idea of the non-denominational movement, with the idea trying to get rid of the backdrop of these larger theological movements and denominations and get back to the text, was always sort of the idea. And so dispensationalism is very popular within it.
And there are certain denominations that do favor dispensationalism, kind of like a lot of Southern Baptist, Pentecostals, Charismatics. And there are some American Protestant denominations that are like complete opposite of them, right? And some have even gone as far as saying that it's heretical. There are a lot in the Presbyterian denominations that are very anti some of these ideas because of a lot of theological disagreements. But overall, I think because they all count as American Protestants, they still, I mean, you're not going to get disowned by your family if you're Presbyterian, decide to go one day to visit a Baptist church, right? So
that depends on the family, but you're right.
So there are some denominations that fall in the category of dispensationalism, some that don't, some that are very opposed, and that are in some other denominations where it depends on the church, really. Right.
It can be very atomized.
And you were the one who actually introduced me to the I guess the word dispensationalists, because your personal history is also wrapped in it as well. But before we go into that, Jason, I was wondering if you could just, I don't know, describe a bit more about their history, like how they developed in America, and what it actually meant for American Christians at large.
That's a tall order for the time that we have today, because that's probably worthy of 2 shows unto itself. But okay, a grand overview is this: you have the Protestant Reformation, right, 500 years ago, and one of the arguments made by the Catholic Church was, hey, if everyone's reading the Bible for themselves, then they'll come up with then there'll be as many theological positions as there are, and doctrines as there are people. Okay, turns out he wasn't wrong. But what that meant is the Protestant movement very quickly sort of atomized into people exploring the topics for themselves, right? You have eventually, we're jumping ahead several hundred years here, but you have essentially different theologians exploring different topics, different ideas. And everyone sort of starts arguing not about the text, right? Or even maybe a particular tradition or an archaeological discovery, but rather a lot of what Schofield, Darby, and a bunch of others start seeing, again, about 100 or so over 100 years ago, is everyone's arguing up here, right? They're arguing over what people say, people said, other people said about the text, right? And that seems to be most of the fighting, and not really about the getting back to the actual text itself and say, okay, this is the word of God. Let's sola scriptura, all that. Then let's focus on that. That they notice that fight just is, it's up here. It's not here at the point. So I would argue that's really what sort of happened, is because popular, printing press, it's late 1800s. More people have more money. It's, you can actually start communicating a little more easily. It becomes this movement to sort of say, hey, we kind of need to get back to the original. You'll hear this, sort of the Acts church, right? And that's where this movement originally starts as, is this idea of getting back to the text. Well, within that, you have the birth of what's called dispensationalism. And the easiest way to explain dispensationalism is to think of it this way. God deals with humanity in a particular way, given a particular time frame, right? So, for example, prior to Noah, right, and it's not too different from covenantalism per se, but rather saying that's the dispensation, right? You have the Adamic covenant, and you could also say the Noahic covenant is also the same, but that's one dispensation, right? It's God
like
dealing with man in that way. Yeah. Exactly.
And so like the Genesis story was one dispensation, right? Like Adam in the Garden
right.
of Eden. That's like the first dispensation.
Correct.
And then you have the flood was another dispensation, and then post flood.
It would go. They would argue it would go because essentially the Adamic covenant and the Noahic covenants are essentially the same. Okay. But they would say usually around the Abraham is when you get a new dispensation, because now God's dealing with Abraham. And then definitely by the time you get to the Mosaic covenant, that's the new dispensation, right? Because how you get to God has changed. And so it's like, okay, we've gone from here to here. Now we're doing this now. And then you get to Christ, that's another dispensation. And so essentially God is going to operate in a particular way during a particular dispensation so that we understand what's happening. And when he changes dispensations, then those that come with their own unique set of rules and assumptions and foundations and all that, right? There's also it also returns, it gets away from what's known as it's got a couple different words for it. Easiest way to think of it is replacement theology. It does completely eschew replacement theology, which means those who believe in replacement theology, which tend to be the traditional, like some of the older traditions, even Catholics to a point, it says, again, God had, was dealing with the Hebrews, but with the coming of Christianity, the Hebrews are no longer God's chosen people. The church replaces Israel. That's the idea of replacement theology. Dispensationalism rejects that and says, no. Israel is still Israel. The church is the church. They are two different things, right? Yes. For salvation, the church is it. You don't go through Israel to be saved anymore the way it was in the Old Testament. There's a new covenant. There's a new dispensation. That's the way to God. But God has not rejected necessarily his promises to the nation of Israel, the genetic lineage of Abraham, and all of that, right? So that's probably the other major part is it rejects dispensationalism, which is also why it is sort of or dispensationalism rejects replacement theology, which is why in the evangelical movement there is such a love for the nation of Israel. It is to say, hey, those are still God's chosen people. We should still protect the Jews. This is still part of God's plan. We can't reject them, because to reject them is ultimately to reject Christ. So dispensationalists would look at things like the Holocaust or the pogroms of Europe and say, that's terrible, right? It's like, that's completely wrong. So whereas a replacement theologian would say, what does it matter if, yeah, obviously they wouldn't condone the deaths of the Hebrews, right? They wouldn't do that. But they would also say there's no need for people of Hebrew descent to have any kind of special protection or concern, because the church has replaced the Hebrew people as God's chosen people. So that's sort of the big thing. Is how dispensationalism is how the idea is it's how God is dealing with humanity during particular epochs or time frames. It also rejects replacement theology. Now, you actually sent a really great image, is sort of explaining the whole rapture thing from an eschatological view. Eschatological or eschatology just means study of the end times. So there's a couple of different views. I really don't want to get into post-millennialism or amillennialism because it'll make my head hurt. So the first two are the ones, the top two are the ones we want to look at. One quick term to understand is premillennialism. What that means is that that the epoch that we live in, the dispensation we live in, is before Christ's promised return to rule as Messiah on earth as a king, right? We see that in Revelation 19. He returns, he sets up shop, and he's the one in the chair for the entire planet now, right? So that's the millennial reign. To be premillennial means that has not yet occurred. Postmillennial will say, well, it has technically occurred through the church. Amillennials will say there is no millennium. It's all metaphor anyway, right? But dispensationalists and many evangelicals are premillennial, meaning we know that has not yet occurred, right? The pre-tribulational rapture is premillennial, but what it says is before that final 7-year tribulation period, that Jesus comes for the church, raptures the church, and only the church. Both the dead and the living in Christ are raptured at that point, which then removes the Holy Spirit from the world, which then causes or allows the Antichrist to come into power and the final 7 years to begin. It does now, just for one bit of clarification, it doesn't mean that would happen immediately. It just means the rapture has to occur before the final 7 years. That's all it means, right? There's some people who will say it happens immediately. Others will say it can have up to 10 or 15 years, right? As a difference. But that's the basic idea of the pre-tribulational rapture, is that before that final 7-year period that is laid out in the book of Revelation and is promised in Daniel and is spoken about by Jesus, that before that occurs, again, it's only the Christians, not the Old Testament saints. Although there's disagreement on that too. Some would say them. However, most strict dispensationalists would say just those in Christ are translated and glorified at that point, as laid out in 1 Thessalonians 4. Again, by the way, we're going to mention a couple different verses here. It's all in the description below if you want to go back and read them for yourselves. Like, we'll read them, but if you want to go back and study it out, it's all down there. My history with this, and again, Donnie, hop in with any questions if something I'm saying doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Throat is still dry.
My throat's kind of scratchy too, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been sucking on lozenges like last 2 days just to kind of keep everything, from going too far astray. I'm over it, just not entirely. So the church I was born into, my parents helped create. They it was, again, non-denominational, dispensationalist, just outside of Dallas, which is, and this is where it becomes important, Dallas is home to the Dallas Theological Seminary, which essentially was created by Schofield.
Real quick, Cyrus Schofield, just got to break down. He was the guy who he came out with the annotated reference Bible back in like the early 20th century, or it was the early 20th century, because he was a little bit after John Nelson Darby's time. And that guy's story is really interesting because he wasn't always a very devout Christian. He was actually a lawyer and a politician, and then got embroiled in some like scandal, I think it was like money laundering or something like that.
Yeah.
And he wound up getting divorced from his wife. And the funny thing is, when he finalized the divorce is the same day that he got ordained. So he kind of fell out with politics and being a lawyer, and then became a very devout Christian and came out with this very influential Bible, which it was like a reference Bible with a lot of annotations, and it really popularized a lot of these dispensational views throughout America. And he was really one of the, again, founding fathers of the modern American evangelical movement.
Yep.
So
100%.
that guy, I think, started the Dallas Theological Seminary.
I can't remember if he started it proper, or if he was just essential in its beginning. I do think he started, but I may be wrong on that. But it's founded here in Dallas. At the very least, it becomes essentially the central hub for dispensational thought, right? It's like there are plenty of other seminaries, but if you're a dispensational evangelical, that's where you go. That's where I was going to go.
You got real close to going too.
Yep. And we'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
For a time, and I mean, for most of my teenage years into college, the pastor who did my mother's funeral, the pastor who oversaw my church, was the provost, and eventually did become the head of the Dallas Theological Seminary. His specialty was the book of Revelation. Like, when I say I grew up a strict dispensationalist, I grew up a pre-millennial, pre-trib, rapture, evangelical. Bona fides are there. That's how I grew up. My Sunday school teacher, and I'm not kidding when I say this Bible was given to me by my Sunday school teacher in junior high. I grew up with his daughter. I'm still good friends with her. Love all of them. He was the religious editor on the New King James Bible. So when I say I know this theology, I wasn't raised in some other tradition and just have an axe to grind, I mean it. We had teachers and Sunday school teachers and all who were going through that seminary in our church doing presentations. We were sort of almost like a proving ground for a lot of these up and coming pastors. I, however, because it's what you do in college, had a bit of a wild streak, and I started hanging out with charismatics.
Oh, you rebel.
I know. I know. Here's where it gets worse. He wasn't just a charismatic. He was a Messianic Jew. I know.
Did he have an earring in his left ear?
No.
Okay, because that was going to go too far, Jason McLean. Too far.
But he does wear hats on Friday night into Saturday, and they do traditional Sabbath, presentations on Friday night.
Man, you were walking on the edge, Jason McLean.
I know. My parents were shocked. But honestly, I was part of the original Hebrew Roots movement when it first sort of kicked off in the very late 90s, very early 2000s. I will say that movement left me. I'm one of those people who was like, hey, the Hebrew Roots movement was only about understanding the Old Testament from its, the original scriptures from the viewpoint of the original church, right? Of the people who wrote it, because what a lot of us had seen, I still hold to, is that a lot of the denominations exist because we look at the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament, not the New Testament through the lens of the Old Testament. Essentially, we're going back to the idea of I often joke I deconstructed from a dispensationalist evangelical Christian to being a dispensationalist evangelical Christian, right? Bible church Christian, because it's about getting back to the text as closely as we can, getting rid of all the junk that man puts on it, and how much more junk can be put on something than reading something with the wrong perspective, right? We're reading oftentimes the New Testament from a Western tradition, and even if there's stuff that's there to be learned, and I think that there is valuable observations from the last 2,000 years, you'd be a fool to reject all of it, to not understand it. But that one of our big goals now is to go back, read the Old Testament within its own context, and say, oh, hold on, how is that changing? Does that change what these verses mean? And it does, right? Then the Hebrew Roots movement went off and said, okay, now you got to become Jewish to be saved. Okay, there's a whole book about that. Literally, the book of Hebrews is telling you that's a bad idea. So pump the brakes there, Skippy. Like I said, they left me. But then I come back to Dallas. Okay, so I should probably stop here. Like I said, like Donnie said, I was going to go to Dallas Theological Seminary. That was the plan. God had other plans for me, and he kept making it very, very clear I was not supposed to go there. And then I was like, okay, well, maybe I can go to one of these another smaller seminary. It's essentially just Dallas Theological Light, but just for, poor people, essentially, is the way to look at it. And it's like, no, I don't want you in any of these seminaries. And it bothered me for a long time, but I'm going to come back as to why I got over that after I tell you this bit. So I'm back in Dallas, right? And I'm working for a title company. I'm like, at this point, and I'm not kidding when I say this, I am one of two people left. Like we went from having 30 plus people to 2. That's how bad it got, right? I was in a closet. I didn't have my office. I'm not kidding when people say, oh, your office is in a closet. I'm not kidding. It was a closet. But while I was working, I could listen to the radio because that's what I was doing, right? I happened to come across, the gentleman passed some time ago. Lovely man, met him once for like 30 seconds, right? His name was Irvin Baxter. His ministry is also in Dallas. It's still there, End Times Ministries. I actually drove by it a couple weeks ago. And he started putting out and talking about ideas about how, the book of Revelation we're reading it incorrectly. We're reading it out of sequence, essentially. So I start going through the long process of re-examining everything, because I think y'all know me well enough to know that if I'm going to deal with something, if someone says something, I'm going to explore it out first. I'm not going to say yay or nay, but I want to hear the evidence. I want to play it out. I play it out. He's right. And we'll do a whole episode on the book of Revelation on how the order and how to read it. it's actually makes it once you kind of see it, you can't unsee it. It makes perfect sense. It's actually way easier than to a lot of people make it more hard to understand, and it's because they're reading it incorrectly as far as the order and sequence, right? And so it's at this point in my life when I start seeing, right, that a lot of the people, because I'm back at that church, because I'm back in Dallas, a lot of these people who are coming out of that seminary, I really wasn't impressed by the way they were thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not making, like, the points they're making are rote. They aren't actually thinking through things. And again, that's any college, that's any seminary. This is not a Dallas theological bash. It's just I started to see that the thing that supposedly we were supposed to be fighting, right, which is this man-made doctrines over the text, was happening in dispensationalism writ large. That they were just, it had become its own denomination. It was what it was supposed to be fighting against, right? And one of the big things, sort of like that last thing that tripped me up and allowed me to go, okay, yeah, I see the problem here. Like, we got some problems. We got some real big problems here. Is the pre-tribulational rapture. So again, this is a long introduction to get to the point of the video. My issue with the pre-tribulational rapture is that it's theologically derived, not exegetically derived. What that means is, exegesis means you're reading from the text, right? Which, by the way, there are lots of ideas I have no problem with. Being theologically derived is not inherently bad, right? It's not bad for something to be theologically derived versus exegetically derived. There's a lot of overlap between the two. You could argue that while there's exegetical defense and a foundation for the Trinity, right, it's still theologically derived. There are lots of ideas that you can make an argument are.
Can you clarify a bit what theologically derived means?
Sure. So instead of it being, say, okay, remember how I said earlier, again, we'll just hop right over here to it, right? When I said, the rapture is, if you mean the rapture to, when you say the word rapture, if you mean it to be the translation from an unglorified body to a glorified body at the end, that's perfectly fine, because that is in Thessalonians, right? Right here, 1 Thessalonians, chapter 4, right? It says in verse 13, chapter 4, but I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring him those who sleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself will ascend from heaven with a shout and the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with him in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. It says it in black and white, right? That's what's happening. That's exegesis, right? But to say something is theologically derived, it says, is to mean I have a belief or a pre-existing framework that I understand these things with, right? And I then look at the totality of the scriptures and I make an argument that is more derived out of an understanding of the Bible. And in this, let's look at the pre-tribulational rapture, okay? The pre-trib rapture goes like this. The church is the bride of Christ. Yes, that's exegesis, right? We know that. It's said explicitly. The 7-year, and this is where things start getting a little dicey. This is, well, there's a 7-year tribulation. Okay. That's a little less foundational. Yes, there is a 7-year period, but if you want to call the entire 7 years the tribulation, that's fine. You could argue it's really only the last 3.5 years of it, but okay, that's fair, right? 7-year tribulation period. And again, that's the dispensational views, that there's a 7-year tribulation. You then say, because the tribulation is God's wrath on humanity, God would not beat the church. Therefore, the rapture from 1 Thessalonians must then therefore take place before the 7-year period. See what I mean? It's theologically driven, or derived. It isn't, well, here in this verse, here, it indicates that it has to happen first, right? There is, it's entirely derived from a theological construct. And it's heavily dependent on certain assumptions, including that the entire 7 years is the tribulation, that the tribulation period is actually God's wrath, and that therefore must require us to be removed. So the problem then, and that I really started seeing, is in order to defend that position, you had to take other positions on verses that made no sense. Like you had to start shuffling some ideas around, right? Again, that the rapture could only be for the church because it wasn't the same thing as the resurrection of Christ that is promised in the Old Testament. So again, it's like, okay, so the Jewish saints aren't resurrected at that point, because that's saved for the resurrection that happens at the end in chapter 11 of the book of Revelations. Because it has to be now, so it's got to be something separate from the resurrection. Now, a lot of people will split that hair and say, well, it isn't that it's separate from, it's all one event. It's just taking over. It has multiple points. Like if you were to say, I went to a music festival and it was multiple days, you wouldn't say you had two or three festivals. It was one festival that took place over 3 days, and there were multiple events. They would a dispensationalist would say the rapture is simply one part of the resurrection, which begins with Christ 2,000 years ago, because he's the first fruits, right? So it's one event, or it's one idea, one thing, multiple events that culminate as one. That would be their defense. But I started noticing some inconsistencies, and the one that I really couldn't get around is separating Matthew 24 from 1 Thessalonians, because this is where everything really fell apart for me, was when I looked at it, and it's like, well, hold on. This ain't math in here, and your arguments against it don't stand. So instead of just talking about it, let me actually read those two sets of verses, right, in their context, and then it'll be a little bit easier to see what I'm talking about. Because the problem is, so the dispensational argument, real quick, would be that the time of the rapture is never stated in the Bible at all. It is never given. It's never hinted at, only to say that you don't know the time and day. That's it, right? The one verse everyone likes to quote about it. Moreover, it's not even in the book of Revelation. It's only alluded to in the book of Revelation, because after the letters to the churches, John is caught up in a vision. That's a symbol of the rapture. Okay, so it's this really important event that Jesus never talks about at all. Only Paul talks about it offhand, and it's not mentioned in the book of Revelation. Got it. Okay, so let's do Matthew 24 real quick. Now, the entire context of the chapter is the end of the world, right? It is his coming, right? That's the whole point. He predicts the destruction of the temple, which occurs in 70 AD. He talks about the signs of the times, the end of the age, the great tribulation, all of that. So this is what's preceding what I'm about to read. We'll start in 27. Again, the verses I think I have in there start in 15, I believe. But that's, again, you want to read the whole thing, you can read the whole thing. But we're going to start a little bit later on that. Yeah, I think I start in 15 on the notes. But that's just to get, if you want, because that's when that's, again, 15 through 28 is literally the Great Tribulation. But we'll start a little bit before that. Verse 26. Therefore, if they say, look, he meaning Jesus, is in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Okay, so already we have sort of the idea of Armageddon being there, right? This is clearly a reference to Ezekiel 38. That's also controversial, but whatever. We'll deal with it in another show. Verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, people will say, well, see, it's heaven, therefore, the Christians aren't on earth at this point. That's an argument that's been made. Problem is, from the four winds, that's earth. It's earth and heaven. Mm-hmm. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When the branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that the summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near and at the doors. Surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Meaning, those who see, when it talks about the generation will not pass away, means those who see these signs, right? The parable of the fig tree, all of these things. The tribulational events is what he's referring to. So again, this is Jesus talking about his coming. We have the gathering together of the elect. Okay, let's go back to 1 Thessalonians, and you tell me if this sounds familiar. Again, 4, right? This is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13. But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow for others who have no hope. We've already read that. Jesus is coming again. Down here at the bottom. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. That's the earth, or that's the heavens, because obviously they're dead, they're in heaven. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Thus we shall always be with the Lord, and therefore comfort one another with these words. So let me ask this. So when I asked, why is it that Paul, right, is talking about the rapture, you're arguing that he's creating something new when it's very clear he's referencing Matthew 24. It's clearly the same idea. He's even using some of the same language here. So why are we assuming Paul's creating something new? This is the problem. So much of dispensational pre-tribulational thought requires Paul to create the rapture out of whole cloth. And if you go back and you read the book of Acts, that's not Paul. Paul is doing what all true rabbinic scholars would do. He's referencing other people's works, right? Like a lawyer, you reference, you get your backdrop done, you get all of your points made, and you reference other people's materials. Why would Paul not simply, because he isn't talking about something that's brand new. They know what he's talking about. He's just adding a little flourish to it with it, talking about the living specifically. Because he doesn't say, I'm going to tell you something brand new. He's telling them something they already know. Why wouldn't he just be referencing Matthew 24? When I asked that question, The arguments I got against as to why he can't be referencing Matthew 24 don't fly. There's some who will say, well, because Matthew wouldn't be written for a few more decades. I don't buy that. I think Matthew was written very early, but it's irrelevant because even if you use the quote unquote Q document hypothesis, that still means that idea was around. Like they had texts that they knew. So that doesn't fly. Second argument was, sorry, on the camera there we go. Second argument is this. It can't be that Paul is quoting Jesus because the context of Matthew 24. Well, I'm sorry. The second one was, well, it just isn't. Okay, well, that sucks. Like, stop. So the third option is this. Jesus, because he's talking to the disciples and they're talking about his return, he's not talking to the church. Therefore, he's talking only to the Jews. He's not talking to Christians. Paul is talking to Christians, therefore he can't be referencing Matthew 24. If you're listening to me right now, please understand what I just said and the ramifications of what I just said. Because if that's the case, then nothing Jesus ever said matters at all. If that's your view. If you are a Gentile Christian, nothing Jesus ever said matters to you. That is what that position would mean if you take it to its fullest extent. Now, I mentioned that, and they'll say, no, that's not what I'm saying. But that is what you're saying. You're saying that Paul, and some people will say, yeah, the only things Jesus said that matters to the New Testament church is what Paul repeats. People will make that argument. And I'm like, no. I'm not about to, I can't support an ideology that means Jesus's words don't mean anything to me. That makes no sense from any position, and it's a horrific concept to put between me and the God of the universe, Paul. You're telling me that Paul is the man between me and God? That doesn't make sense. There's no good argument for that. So I looked and said, well, if it's clear that Paul is simply referencing Jesus here, then where's the rapture? Meaning, where's the pre-tribulational rapture? There's no pre-tribulational rapture. He's referencing Matthew 24. And Matthew 24 very specifically says, again, exegesis, right? Which, by the way, exegetical learning and exegetical preaching is supposed to be the center point of dispensationalist theology. Again, everything from 15 to 28 is the great tribulation. And I that's not my assumption. It says it right there in the notes. Like, even again, my Sunday school teacher, the religious editor, when they were putting this book together, said, hey, let's put a note here. This is the Great Tribulation. Right here. This is what this referencing is. So 15 to 28, it's not just my reading. It's most everyone's reading. That's the tribulation. Great. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Okay. So what Jesus is talking about happens after all that. And if that's what Paul is referring to, then there's no pre-tribulational rapture at all. Now, let me ask this other question. Is it possible then that the real issue is that we are conflating and we're not conflating, we've broken apart one concept, the resurrection. The word rapture, it's from the Latin, which was the translation from the Greek harpazo, right? All Paul was saying is, hey, if you're alive when Jesus returns, you're translated. That's your resurrection. You don't have to die first because you're alive, but he's come. You get translated right then and there. That's all he's doing. He's not really even adding to it. He's just explaining at the resurrection, which occurs when? At the end, when Jesus returns, you're going to meet him in the air. You don't have to die first. That's all he's saying. And that matches up a lot easier with the book of Revelation, right? Chapter 11. I don't think we'll get to 1 Corinthians or 2 Thessalonians, but I'll mention 2 Thessalonians here in a second. Chapter 11. This is the seventh trumpet, right? It's 11:15. Then the seventh angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." And the 24 elders who sat before God on their thrones fell on their faces and worshiped God, saying, this is key, "We give you thanks, O Lord God Almighty, the one who is and who was and is to come, because you have taken your power, your great power, and reigned. The nations were angry, and your wrath has come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged." So this is the resurrection. "And that you should reward your servants, the prophets, and the saints, and those who fear your name, small and great, and should destroy those who destroy the earth." That's your rapture right there. If the rapture is the resurrection, that makes a lot more sense that the event that Jesus is talking about, which happens after the tribulation, that's right there. It's exegetical. I don't have to create any weird construct. I just have to read the text. That the rapture is simply is for the living, but that's because we're alive. It is part of the resurrection, and everyone goes up at the same time. That's the point. That's what's being said here. That's exegesis. That's not a theological construct. Now, people will say, but hold on. Because once I got to that point, I realized, okay, well, here's something I've missed the entire time. The entire argument is predicated on the idea that the final 7 years is God's wrath. Well, but there's 3 main sections in the book of Revelation. Again, we'll go over the book of Revelation at some point in the future. You have the bowls, or you have the seals, the trumpets, and the vials, or bowls, depending on which translation you're reading. Everyone will say, if you go to a dispensational church, they will say, you've got the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, and the bowl judgments. Here's the problem. You will not find one time in the book of Revelation or any other book the seal judgments or the trumpet judgments. It's the seals and the trumpets. The only thing that are called judgments by God in the book of Revelation are the vials or the bowls. Which, again, when you actually start understanding that it's not necessarily sequential, those occur at the very end of the book. They occur at the end. So after the 7 years has occurred, after, right, that last part, you have the eyewitnesses, the prophets have ascended. They've been killed, resurrected. They've ascended to heaven. You have the 7th trumpet. Then you have the resurrection. Guess what happens? Then the bowls are poured out. That's it right there. Those are the judgments. So yeah, the church is not judged by God because we're gone at that point. No exegesis only, no theological construction. We're all good. So yeah, to answer the question, is it bad theology? The pre-tribulational rapture? Yes, because it's a theological construct that's really constructed on a lot of assumptions that are bad. But as combined with the resurrection, it's exegetical. It is good theology. And unfortunately, a lot of people say, but that means we'll be here during the tribulation. Yeah, we're not going anywhere. Not until the very end. And the problem is, a lot of American Christians are pre-trib because they just don't want to be here. They don't want to go through the tribulation period. Well, sorry, I can't help you there. Suck it up. Do your job. Thanks for watching this clip of Jason McLean Questions Everything. We're live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central. Please share this video with your friends, then like, follow, and subscribe for more.